Okay, hi everybody. Welcome on this beautiful fall evening. Welcome. Tonight is the annual Brendan Gill Memorial Lecture, and there's a nice story behind this. The endowment for the Brendan Gill Lecture was a gift to the school from Herb McLaughlin, a San Francisco-based architect who co-founded the firm Kaplan, McLaughlin, and Diaz, KMD, and who was one of the pioneers of adaptive reuse. McLaughlin received his BA from Yale College and then his MArch from the School of Architecture in 1958. In 1987, he established the Brendan Gill Lectureship Fund to honor his friend, the writer and critic Brendan Gill, a member of the Yale College class of 1936. Brendan Gill was a noted American journalist, I hope you all know this, who wrote for The New Yorker for more than 60 years. He contributed more than 1,200 pieces for the magazine, from Talk of the Town to Broadway reviews, and he was, of course, most importantly and relevant to this, the magazine's architecture critic, writing its Skyline column from 1987 to 1996. Gill was an active guy in New York. He served on the boards of the Andy Warhol Foundation, the Municipal Arts Society, and the New York Landmarks Conservancy, and he was vice president of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. So McLaughlin's instructions when he gave the money was that the Brendan Gill Memorial Lecture be given each year by a noted architectural critic. In the past, the speakers have included Joshua Jelly Shapiro, Kate Wagner, Alexandra Lang, Kathleen McGuigan, Christopher Hawthorne, who is with us tonight, Diane Sudzik from London, among many, many others. And it is a real honor to add Mark Lamster, friend, brilliant writer, funny guy, to the list. So I would describe Mark's writing, and I've known him for years, as being versatile. He's a very rigorous historian. He is the architecture critic of the Dallas Morning News and a lecturer and a Loeb Fellow at the GSD at Harvard. He's also the author of 3 books spanning a wide range of topics. His first, Spalding's World Tour, catalogs the life of the sporting good magnate Albert Spalding and charts the global spread of baseball. Master of Shadows, his second book, is a biography of the Flemish Baroque painter Peter Paul Rubens. And his most recent book, and maybe some of you have read it, is The Man in the Glass House, exploring the paradoxical life of Philip Johnson. Mark has also been a contributing editor of the Architectural Review, the Design Observer, and ID, and he writes often for Architect, Architectural Record, and Metropolis. He also writes in national publications of general interest, including the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Wall Street Journal. He's received a number of awards for his writing, including the Rabkin Prize for Arts Journalism, the Robert Detchert Award for Civic Journalism from the Dallas Morning News, and the Flowers Medal from the Texas Society of Architects. And in 2018, The Man in the Glass House was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award for Biography. Tonight, his lecture is titled The Flattening, Why Everything Looks Like Everything Else and What to Do About It. No doubt something that has been on all of our minds. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mark Lamster.
Wow, thank you for that introduction. Overly generous. And now I have to figure out how to get this to work. Come on. Dave. Dave is the AV coordinator. Help.
Everyone, this is Dave.
Oh, here we go. Whoop. Well, she said it'd be funny. Thank you. Excellent. Yes, so as you've heard... Nothing but the best at Yale, nothing but the best. Thank you for that very kind introduction. Yes, the title for today is The Flattening, or Why Everything Looks Like Everything Else and What You Can Do About It. I figured I would start out by talking a little bit about what I do, which is be an architecture critic. And here you have what I think most people think an architecture critic still looks like, Ellsworth Toohey, the villainous snob of the horrible book, The Fountainhead, which was turned into a not quite as terrible film. And I think my editors think this is still what an architecture critic should be, the sort of dandy snob, kingmaker orchestrating the world behind the scenes. And I really wish things were still like that, but in some ways. But the reality is somewhat different, thankfully. So let me tell you how I got to this place. I was born and raised in New York, which I guess is how I started thinking about buildings and cities. And I grew up in the 70s and 80s in New York City. And I like to show these two images from two films that I loved. I guess the one on the left is a Woody Allen film. Maybe we're not supposed to say we enjoyed Woody Allen films anymore, whatever. Never mind his sexual issues. You can see here this incredibly nostalgic, romantic view of the city here, the Queensboro Bridge. And then on the right, from essentially the same time, and maybe a year later, still from Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver. And of course, Scorsese's film portrays New York as a city of scuzzos and dangerous people and violence. And to me, these two cities coexisted at the same time. I knew them both. There were blocks I couldn't walk on when I was growing up for fear of getting mugged. In that time, we walked around, if you were a kid in the 70s in New York, you walked around with mug money, like that would work. So to me, this is what cities are about and what brings me joy in writing about them. Their incredible complexity, their contradiction, their paradoxical nature. So I should say, in college I studied writing, and in graduate school I studied architectural history, so I have the only job in the world that I'm qualified for, writing about architecture. But I didn't start out writing. I started out as a book editor at Princeton Architectural Press, and this is how I got to know Deborah Burke. You could see this is one of the books I did with her, Architecture of the Everyday, and Stephen Harris. So they're still talking to me, I guess, so that's a good sign. Another book I did was a book on this very building with photographs by Ezra Stoller. This is now so old, this was before there was a horrible, horrible addition to this building. Cops coming. Can I stay? Can I stay? Am I getting thrown out yet? Okay, good. No. Yeah. As Deborah noted, I wrote the book about the man in the glass house, Philip Johnson, and his incredibly complicated and complex life. I like to say that he lived for 98 years, and he was stirring up trouble for all of it. So life was really a reflection of the American century. Of course, you know him here from his buildings on the Yale campus. Neither of them, especially, there are a few of them beyond even this, but there's, of course, the Klein Science Tower, which now has a commissary in front of it, awkwardly placed, another problem. And then on the right, his epidemiology building, which was from his ill-fated brutalist phase. Pretty terrible building, sorry. He was pretty hit or miss on the architecture. But again, I think a figure, a walking paradox, a walking opposition, a man who could exist on both sides of any argument. And I think that makes him interesting. I think that's what makes cities interesting. And it's what makes Dallas interesting. I like to call Dallas, writing about Dallas is like going to the circus every day. Living in Texas is that way a little. It's not always heartening, but it's always entertaining. And you can see the kind of diverse kind of writing I like to do for the paper. So 3 recent stories here. And I should say, the Ellsworth Toohey, the traditional idea of the architecture critic is we write only about, major monumental buildings that are, arts institutions and such, but I like to think it's writing much more about the city and how we live in the city. So you can see some of the diversity of the things I do at the paper. So on the left, a column was about what AI might mean for architecture criticism, and my friend Chris Hawthorne had the temerity to write a letter to the New York Review of Architecture complaining about this essay. I love you, Chris, but you were wrong. Happens very rarely. He's almost always right. In the center, a story about the hiring of a new design team for the Dallas Museum of Art, big national story, and then a preservation story on a Frank Lloyd Wright building. And preservation is something I care a lot about. I feel like preservation has become a dirty word now. There's become this zero-sum game, I think, between preservation and its association with NIMBYism and housing. And I'd like to think we can save our most important works of architecture and communities without, and also have housing. I do think that's possible. And I will say that most times I see buildings knocked down, it's not to build affordable housing, I assure you. I also like to write about the history and significant buildings in the history, because I think an important part of the job is to explain the city to itself and to look back on important moments in its constructed history and explore them and tell narrative stories about them. So three critical buildings for Dallas here. One, the North Park Center Mall. The most popular place in Dallas is a mall. Okay, snicker if you will, but it's a great mall. I.M. Pei's City Hall, and then Welton Beckett's amazing Hyatt Regency, which you may be familiar from the credit sequence to Dallas, the TV show. And every year I like to write one really takeout story that's like a long form narrative. This is one from, I guess, 3 years ago now, on an African-American freedmen's town that's actually within the borders of Dallas. So this is a small town within Dallas, a community that was formed by freed slaves and freed enslaved people. And since its founding in 1872, it has been systematically abused, neglected, exploited by the city of Dallas. So this, and you can see it here, caught between railroad tracks and this essentially wet waters from the Trinity. And you can see how close it is to the city. You can actually see the skyline just 6 miles away to its north. But this exists in a sort of other world, completely disconnected. When the Klan was powerful in Dallas in the 20s, this area was where the Klan came down to do their whippings. They'd bring people down here and take the residents themselves. And you can see here, there's actually a clipping from the Dallas Morning News story about how it was actually the police who were doing it. So yeah, we have that history. And this is the shocking thing to me was that when the railroad company that operates these tracks adjacent to, on the left here, when they wanted to expand their facilities, they just shut down the only road out of the community that pedestrians could use, and even then it was dangerous. So this story was about how this neighborhood was systematically stranded. They're still trying to build batch plants adjacent to it. It's a constant fight for the environmental health of this community. So that was a really rewarding story to do. More recently, this past year, a major story on the reinvention, a plan to reinvent Dealey Plaza. Of course, Dealey Plaza, where the Kennedy assassination took place. And I had the chance to collaborate with Stas Landscape Architecture and Monica Ponce de Leon, an architect who's dean at Princeton. And this area is incredibly dangerous, and because people are walking into traffic. It has never been closed. Dallas has a very challenging relationship with its history, especially that moment of which is considered a pox and an embarrassment on the city. So the city has basically left this space unaltered, which means that all these assassination tourists just walk into the middle of this high-speed intersection. It's incredibly dangerous. It's one of the most dangerous intersections of the city. And beyond the triple underpass, which you can see here, there is a park dedicated to victims of lynching in Dallas, but it's completely inaccessible. So the idea here was to bring in an architectural team, a design team, a landscape architecture team, to try and figure out how to make this space more pedestrian friendly to cyclists, and also more safe and more honorific. So we made this beautiful proposal, and the city has been talking about it. And we're, hoping to get it built, but that's a long way to go. But I think that's the power of architecture criticism. And again, this all started from my observations, just like, walking through, seeing these X's crudely painted into the ground by the assassination tourists. Whenever the city tries to get rid of them, the conspiracy theorists just come and repaint them. And it's just this very dangerous bleak place to look. I was walking on it when we were doing this, and someone had discarded a wig out their window. So that's the kind of way this sort of Martyrs Park is treated. This was right in front of that park, so kind of very, very sad. And the idea to give access to this, I think, was really important. But I think now we can move on to the why everything looks the same portion of the evening. But again, it comes out of, I think, the best writing, and also I think maybe the best design, best architecture comes from seeing things that we take for granted and then writing about it or taking action about it. And so this story came from things that I was seeing. So here are 4 cars from I think this was 1978. Why did I choose 1978? I don't know. It could have been 76, 77, whatever. But you can see each of these cars is incredibly distinctive. A Jaguar looks like actually like a Jaguar, right? It's hunched, it's fast. Volvo is a box. Mercedes is kind of bubbly. A BMW is cute. I don't know. So these are what these cars looked like in 1978. These exact same cars, this is what they look like now. They look all exactly the same. And now maybe you're saying, well, that's just those 4 fancy European brands. But I assure you, no. All cars look like this now. And in fact, this is the most ridiculous car on the road. This is a Lamborghini. It is a rolling oxymoron, right? The whole idea of an oxymoron of a Lamborghini is to stand out, to be fast, to look different. And yet they made the most bourgeois car that you could possibly make. So why are all of our cars looking exactly the same? Why are they all white? Why are they all white, gray, or black? The overwhelming majority of cars sold in the United States are monochrome. And there are reasons, I guess, why we've decided that this white SUV is the car we want. There are economic factors, there are manufacturing factors, governmental factors, but really, I don't really see that actually explains why everyone wants the same white car. Is this have we arrived at some nirvana of perfect car design? I don't think that's it either. Just something about the way we exist, a sense of conformity, I think. So I've been trying to investigate that, and alas, I think it also applies to architecture. Maybe you're saying, like, well, that's just cars. But I think we're also seeing it in architecture. So for example, these are 4 houses I just picked from random in the neighborhood around where I live in Dallas, and you can see there's a Craftsman, and there's a Moderne, and Mediterranean, a Tudor. And in this community, there's tons of new building because it's very wealthy. And this is what all of the new houses now look exactly like this. This is a style that we've taken to calling transitional modern. What does that mean? It means it's neither modern nor traditional. It's some kind of Pottery Barn catalog nonsense, nothingness. It kind of wants to step into modernism, but also is afraid to do that, and also wants the comfort of traditionalism. It's always painted white and detail-free. It's sort of just a very sad state of affairs. And of course, all the interiors are also, right out of catalogs. They're all very beige. And then, so again, we're moving towards this weird, banal, khaki sameness. And then if you expand out to a little lower end on the market, you see the sprawl and this constant, sameness we have in these sprawling communities. And aside, the trads always want to blame modernism for all the ills of the city, but when it comes to the suburbs, they never want to blame traditionalism for this crap. Why is that? Why is that? Very interesting. But these, I think we're seeing the sort of boring sameness is the sort of defining characteristic of this typology that is actually taking over our cities. And so these are all projects rising in a 5-block radius in Dallas. And you can see it's this grayish, beige, 5/1 monster that is become the defining architectural typology of the contemporary city, and especially Dallas, but everywhere. They change a little depending on where you are. In Dallas, their height is constrained by the height of a fire engine ladder, because they're all, of course, sticks over bricks, wood frame construction, so they can light up quite easily. I parodied this in this, made a diagram of the characteristics of these things. They can stretch on, and always like these bays, they can stretch on endlessly. They're cheap wood frame construction covered with ephes or some other crappy covering. Maybe they do one bay has metal siding to say architecture. They're horrible on the street. They're quite and they're like the kudzu crawling all over our cities. And so what's going on here? How did it get to be this way? I'm glad you're laughing at this. I was wondering whether Scooby-Doo, you all would be too young to get a Scooby-Doo reference. But yeah, so private equity, our corporate capitalist structure. I think part of the problem with these things is they're built by corporations that are not necessarily have anything to do with the cities they're building in, so they have no relationship to that place, don't really care. It's all, these projects aren't architecture, they're just like spreadsheet units. I always get nervous when architecture is referred to as product. When it starts using this sort of phrases of finance capitalism. And so how did we as a country come to be this nation of conformists? And I think because we like to think of ourselves as these rugged individualist Americans, but I think there's another, if we want to trace back to our history, try and understand, where all this conformity is coming from. And so this is a picture that of Nebraska, and you can see the homesteads created after the 1785 land use ordinance written by Thomas Jefferson. And the idea there is to Jefferson to sort of tame this west and northwest and south for America, this idea that there was actually no one there and that it all had to be claimed. So we'll throw grids over it and we can occupy it that way and all have our happy little homesteads out here. And I will say, this sort of frontier, out on the wilderness by yourself. Not that they were, I think it's really shaped the American culture and way of being and way of thinking about itself, especially when you think about it in relationship to the North and the Northeast where we are. So here in communities like you see here, such as they are, and there's a demand for generosity, for cooperation, for hospitality. When you're out in the middle of farmland and you run out of milk, you can't run to the store. You have to run to your neighbors. If there's someone sick, you have to run to your neighbors, etc. And I was just walking on a tour with Chris Hawthorne and Eva-Lisa Pelkonen today, and we're walking on High Street, and just a comparison between this and the Northeast. Northeast is industrial. It's ruled by the clock. Everyone's in a rush all the time. And, if you walk down onto High Street, onto the campus, over this arch, there's a clock, right? You are ruled by the clock all the time. When you walk onto campus, the first thing you see is the clock that tells you that you're late. So everyone here is in a rush. There is not the same demand for hospitality as there is, say, in the South and in the West, and that's why people from the South think everyone from the Northeast is assholes. And we won't say what the people from the North think of the people in the South. But I do think these sort of, the way that the land is, and the sort of industrial pastoral relationship explains these sort of behaviors. This is what Iowa looks like, right? So we see Jefferson's grid now expanded into counties, 100, I believe, counties of Iowa. It will make it very easy for the GOP to organize their primary system. And here we see the same, moving a little bit forward, the 1811 Commissioner's Plan of New York, which laid out the famous Manhattan grid. And again, sameness that would cover the entire city for the purposes of real estate speculation, to make it easy for real estate speculation. And of course, you can see the contours of the land here that are basically going to be just completely erased as the city pushes north. Now, if we move a little farther ahead, we see the architecture that this sort of real estate design. Sorry, I stole this from Shutter or whatever. Anyway, hopefully there won't be a bill. I'll send that to you, Deborah. So you can see the architecture that this instilled in the city, and not just New York, but here you can see this sort of sameness in Baltimore, the Baltimore row house, the Boston triple-decker. So yes, there is a sameness to all of these native formats. They're all a little different depending on the circumstances of the individual city. So New York is brownstone, Baltimore's got brick, wood frame up in Boston. And they're kind of great, right? I mean, this is beautiful. They're all slightly different. There's detail, there's color, they're beautifully made even. And so if you compare that to, like, again, the contemporary equivalent is this sticks over bricks beige block, which has no character. So it's kind of sad how far we've gone. Now, jumping even farther, we move into the modern period. And of course, the massive economic expansion of the post-war period necessitates a new kind of building for this management class that we've created for ourselves. And of course, there's more conformity here. You get buildings in this sort of modernist form culminating here quite beautifully. And of course, there develops in the 50s and 60s in this post-war period a whole kind of literature trying to understand the conformity that culture and that economic system and those buildings sort of created for our city. And that gets us to now, and where we are now. And I think there's been sort of a fracturing of the social compact there, right? I think this idea of like conformity of that period, I think we're still conformists, but for various reasons, our culture is kind of fractured. And so the office buildings we have taken on this sort of Jenga style, but they're appearing everywhere themselves. So the center is in Boston, here's one in Chicago, here's one in Dallas. All of a sudden, every building has to look like a Jenga tower, this sort of offset tower. I don't really understand this format. The idea is that it creates these roof terraces, but I don't think anyone has ever used one of the terraces on one of these buildings. It's a very strange architectural form. And I like to joke that if Mies built the Seagram building today, it would have to look like this. And I think if Phyllis Lambert watches this, she'll have a fit. And then, of course, there's this other condition, because everything has to be like everything else. We are such teenagers. Everyone has to be like everyone else. So here we see this typology that has come to define basically every new public building. The bleacher stare. Here's one by Jeannie Gang. Here's one by Howler and Yoon. Here's one by Nader Turani. All great architects, but they're all building the same form of public space, which I don't think is actually very good as public space. And if you have any kind of mobility challenge, these can be a disaster. And of course, famously now, Stephen Hole's library, Hunters Point Library in Queens, had so many stairs that he is now being sued by the city because it's completely inaccessible and it's just become a giant fiasco. So a warning, if you're thinking about designing these stairs, please reconsider. So this gets me to the heart of this lecture, which is like, how do we solve this problem? How do we get around everybody doing everything like everybody else? My friend Andrew Bernheimer, who you may have heard about recently because his office in New York is the first to have unionized. I think it's a really interesting thing that's happening there. I'm feeling confident that it's going to work out. I've heard from a lot of architectural firm owners that this is the end of the universe and that it will never, architecture can never support this. Of course, every one of them always drives like a Porsche and has a country house. So I'm not sure. But I'm not here to talk about Andy's unionization effort. That's really interesting and I think important. But really about this philosophy of finding the architecture that he practices with. And it's not about like going out and looking for interesting buildings. It's about how do you find architecture in the constraints of contemporary practice? How do you find originality? How do you find something new that also works with the city? So this is this huge public project he did out in Queens and Flushing. It's called One Flushing. There's like hundreds of apartments in here. It's 400 feet long, which is ridiculous. If you studied any kind of affordable housing, you know, and especially in New York, you know how onerous the bureaucratic conditions are, along with the financial conditions of making projects like this. It's incredibly difficult to do anything except build a dumb box that's boring looking, and then incredibly long, so you get the stick sober bricks. Boring question. So how do you get around that? And I thought it's really telling how he approached that challenge in this project. The street here is one where commuter buses line up to take members of the community into the city and to other parts of Queens. I'm a Manhattanite, so to me, the city is Manhattan. That's funny, laugh. So here, the answer for Andy was in the details of building code. So New York building code requires that any street frontage facade be 70% has to be within 15 feet of the curb. Okay, what that means is almost everybody just pushes their entire building up on the curb because that's the easiest thing to do and it's the way you get the most bang for your buck. But what he here did, and you can see, is he staggered the facades out, finding that extra 30% that was leeway to create this extra wide sidewalk. And the result is it gives this facade actual activation, along with some smart material use and nice, pacing and design. So whereas those sticks over brick projects that, I was showing you, there is no real reason why these, you would have one bay, in one form or one bay the next. Here there's actual logic behind the organization. So I think this is a really wonderful project. And here up on the roof, when you're doing public housing, the roof doesn't have to be reserved for someone who can afford, a penthouse and open space on their penthouse. It can be devoted to things like community garden, laundry facilities up on the roof, so everyone who comes and does laundry can look out. And this building is like, I think, 70% is, 30% AMI, so really dedicated to lowest income families, and 30% is for seniors. So it's a really admirable project and very challenging to do work in that field. And Andy manages to find a way to find the architecture. Another architect I really admire, I think, found a way out of this challenge. Lorcan O'Herlihy in Los Angeles. I don't know anyone who figures out this sort of housing more elegantly than Lorcan, this sort of housing projects. And this is privately built university housing for UCLA students. And you can see here, it's colorful. I mean, you're allowed to use colorful paint and materials. It's constructed of metal shedding that has, looks great on the street. It's not your typical ephes. It's not expensive though, and takes advantage of the local climate to have spaces outside, to have corridors and circulation space on the exterior of the building, thereby saving money from not having to build those spaces out, and energy-wise it's more efficient. So just a really clever use of the challenge, taking advantage of what can be found on the site to create something inventive rather than, again, just more of that generic khaki-colored, what have you, apartment blockage. This project just recently completed in Boston, the Bay State co-housing development. So this is co-housing, which is communal living, not for me, for sure, by the firm French 2D. Jenny French teaches with me at the GSD. They're terrific architects. And again, it's finding ways, obviously it's an unusual client, co-housing, but what they've done is taken the traditional Boston triple decker and sort of turned it inside out, used those and here you can see, what it looks like from the street. Those typical balconies that you see on the Boston triple decker are instead pointed to the inside. There we go. And it's full of color. It's pink and pastel, as if it's from Miami. And it creates a sense of community on the interior rather than this traditional Boston just pushing to the everything to the street. So it's able to find a new way with an old typology to make something interesting and positive in the environment. This development in Fort Worth by Marlon Blackwell. I think Marlon is one of the more original architects in the country. He's managed to create a real American vernacular by working with, or an original American architecture by working with vernacular forms. So here you can see for this small mixed-use development, he's taken Quonset huts and turned them into a multi-use project in all different ways, and he deploys the Quonset hut in many different ways. The landscape here is by Dirt Studio, Julie Bardman, also really terrific. And you can see these forms, if you are familiar with, and I hope you are, Lucan's Kimball Museum, they sort of mimic that, sort of an homage to the Kimball. And each one of these units on the upstairs is market rate housing. Below it is a commercial space. And then there in front of it, and you can see what these fabulous things look like, just rough and ready, throw it up, very inexpensive to do this. I'm not a big fan of shipping container houses. I don't think that's a very successful or wise use of that type. It's become like a cliche. Unless you're low tech, I would avoid it. But here, the Quonset hut works more. It's much larger, so once you can insulate these things and still actually have space, which is handy. And here you can see what Marlon's done on the ground. He's actually taken the Quonset huts and flipped them on their sides. Really creative use to find. There's one is a restaurant and a gallery, coffee shop, because all developments need to have coffee shops, and this works very nicely in the sort of bohemian quarter of Fort Worth. And finally, a project by Emmanuel Pratt has led he is the founder of the Sweetwater Foundation, which you can see in the foreground here on the south side of Chicago. You can see Chicago out there in the distance. This area, a little bit like Joppy in Dallas, in that it's this neglected, disinvested place. And Emmanuel found some unused land and just started squatting on it, essentially turning it into farmland and building on it for the community. And he's dedicated to the community. I think it's a different way of practicing. And you can see that they've built, this isn't like an artist project where you bring it, like I guess the Astor Gates, which is great, but that's, artists building for artists. This is really the community building for the community. So Emmanuel designs these fantastic structures, a grow house, greenhouse on site, and then they're built by the community, for the community, worked by the community, and he's created this entire little ecosystem that's ever expanding, taking advantage of all the abandoned land in that area. And here's some of these lovely do-it-yourself architecture that he's created, and you can see it's really about creating community and place here, and bringing life back to this area that is so neglected. It's a really admirable project. So finally, I thought I'd return to Philip Johnson, because I always do. So in 1956, or 1955, Johnson gave this lecture at Harvard called The Seven Crutches of Modern Architecture. And it was published the next year in Perspecta. So Yale played a critical part in disseminating this, what I think is one of his really more special works of writing. He was a wonderful critic and writer. So the idea here was to talk to students and discuss what in his mind at that moment were the crutches or sins that led to mediocre architecture. So these were his 7 crutches of modern architecture. The first was history, sort of a reliance on pattern book, historical forms, pretty drawing. I think today we might interpret this as a pretty computer rendering that we've all seen. But for him, it was that you could make anything look good in a drawing, right? We all know that. Utility, sort of the idea that just by making something functional, that was enough. Comfort, the idea that everything has to be comfort. He would talk about in this relation, his penchant for Miesian chairs. They might not be comfortable, but they look great. And for him, that was more important than comfort. Cheapness speaks for itself. The idea of pleasing the client, and of course, that's something every architect faces, is how do you wrestle with clients who want to do all kinds of terrible things. And then the final was structure, sort of a reliance on the engineer to find solutions for architecture, which he considered principally art. So I will conclude. I think these are still really relevant and interesting, but I would like to conclude this altogether too brief talk by giving you my own revised set of sins of contemporary architecture. And I will say the first would be being boring. And I say that with the caveat, knowing there is a proponent of the everyday. Architecture here is like being boring, except when being boring is your intention, and it is done with intentionality. Junkiness, of course, the sort of cheap building that is a sort of defining characteristic of our era. A lack of ideas. I had a soccer coach when I was a kid, and we'd all be running around, as kids, you run around in a little pack chasing the ball, and he would scream out from the sideline, have an idea out there, have an idea out there. And I always appreciated that although I wasn't always able to generate one. So, have an idea, think of something original, do something, find a way around problems, as a sort of architects I demonstrated here, or autocentricism, God, this is really sloppily written. Devoting your energy to the car, putting the car first. I see this just constantly. I would need to move away from that, obviously. Lack of sustainability. Obviously, we're all going to be underwater soon, so that's a problem. And inequitability. Oh, God, who did this? Building, I think we need to understand and be constantly thinking about how to build equity in our cities. I come from a place, Dallas, that is one of the most inequitable places, a place that's incredibly divided. And I'd like to think that architecture and, to some extent, criticism has a role to play in fixing some of those inequities, improving the life of not just those with means, but those without. And also the planet, which seems to be struggling these days. And with that, I open this forum to your enthusiastic questions.
Thanks for this lecture. I really appreciated the examples. I'm from a town where a lot of the older houses are being changed into these modern duplexes, and I often go and visit them with my mom, and we take a look inside, and I think they're hideous, but she really likes the open kitchens and the big windows and the fact that it's just a practical place for her to make a home. So I guess if you were if you had some time with my mom, like, what would you say to her? How do you reconcile the need for beautiful cities with, like, what people who live in these affordable housing units actually want and care about?
Well, I'd almost put that. You can't argue with individuals wanting like a comfortable life. I think that's important, and it's a real challenge to build architecture that's scale at quality. So really, I don't know that there's anything that gosh, that's a really hard question. I think my job is to educate about possibilities and qualities that make a place livable. I think, obviously, one of the things about Dallas that makes it appealing is that it is so easy to live there. It's very car friendly, and convenience is a really strong factor. And I think you have to respect, when you're trying to make changes in a place like that could be drastic, you have to respect people's expectations and try and work within them. It's not so easy to fix. It's not so easy to change. I don't really like to talk about taste a lot. I wouldn't like, I think the question is like, you ask your mom, like, well, what do you value in a neighborhood? And I think people's values are changing. I mean, it's really, the question is less about what seniors, what people like your age are going to be asking for. And I think we can see all around the country in cities that people are wanting more pedestrian-oriented spaces. I want cities that they can walk through, that are not burning hot, and quality spaces and communities that are supportive of our needs. So we don't have to drive everywhere, which is both dangerous, expensive, and poor for the environment. Sorry, that was a roundabout way to answer that question.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It was very interesting and entertaining. But I had a question specifically about the slide with the bleacher stare and how everyone wants to do what everyone else is doing. As architects, I feel like we have to use precedent to inform a lot of what we're doing and for inspiration. And how do we balance using precedent wisely versus just doing what everyone else on Art Daily is doing?
How? I think the answer is by really talking to your clients about what they need and tailoring what you do to the specifics of a certain, whatever that specific project is going to be. Everyone is different. Every place is different. Every lot size is different, and the needs of every community are different. So instead of just doing what seems to be fashionable and what other people have done, is let's concentrate on how a place is actually used, right? I think I've seen so many of these bleacher stairs unused, and certainly if you are have a disability, a movement disability, they're a disaster. So we need to understand that those people are there, and design needs to work for them also, for everyone. So I think just wiping out precedent is almost as useful as following it.
We'll go here and then we'll go around to the other side. So the gentleman here in the black shirt.
Hi, thank you so much for the lecture. I had a question regarding architecture journalism as a profession, and especially in the context of the global south. I don't see architecture criticism still hasn't really established itself globally, whereas in the West you were describing about how it has reached a particular peak and now seems to be in decline. So what do you see as the future of architecture journalism as a profession?
I'm just glad I have a job. I was actually just sent this questionnaire about what architectural journalism was going to look like in 20 years or 25 years. And I don't really know the answer. I hope will always be writing and people will be paid for it. But I feel like the means of communication are changing dramatically. Podcasts are now like a primary way we communicate ideas. We're talking through TikTok and X. I'm going to quit that soon. But there are all these different means of communicating. I don't think it's just, the written, essay in the magazine or newspaper. I'm a dinosaur, frankly. I'm going to go extinct soon. So the question is like, what is next? And in a way, it's like a very, I don't think it's a super bright, future, but I think talented people will always succeed or usually succeed. And I think there's an audience, and especially in the global South. So if that's, there's a huge population, there's the dynamics in those countries are changing dramatically in terms of the ability to afford new building. And also the challenges of the environment are getting worse and worse. So there's more and more and more of a need for that kind of writing. And I think there's a real audience for it. Exactly what format that will happen in and how it pays for itself is a broader question. I do think, associations with institutions is one way that's going to happen, because paying for it in the private sector through news organizations is becoming very challenging.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. I was thinking, looking at these 7 scenes of contemporary architecture, what do you think about the idea of risk, like creative risk, financial risk, but within the architecture practice, or the lack of risk?
Well, I mean, the problem with so much architecture today is that there is no risk. It's all, created by organizations who, it's not architecture. Most of the building that we see, it's spreadsheet economics. What's the cheapest way to do the most here and there, and sometimes, we do need housing, so that there's a call for that, but. I think, the intellectual risk, I think, is incredibly valuable, and that's kind of what you're here at school to be doing. Asking clients to actually take a risk that their roof may fall in on them is maybe less of a plausible scenario. But I don't think the best architecture is necessarily risky. We looked at a project by Lorcan O'Hurley. There's nothing risky about that. It's different. It's not what people are used to. The difficult part is getting people to understand that that's a possibility. So I don't think that's like we're asking for danger.
Thanks for the talk. I have a general question, which I'm asking myself quite a lot, and I don't have an answer. But I really don't know what good architecture makes good architecture and what bad architecture makes bad architecture, because...
I'm sorry, I lost you there. Could you repeat what you just said?
I just said, I really don't understand what good architecture makes good architecture and bad architecture makes bad architecture, because I would normally argue like you to other people, and then I would look around and see that it's not so easy sometimes. I would say that we as architects are so focused on our own profession that we give ourselves so much value and so much power, and we normally don't have this. When you go to the global south, and there is not a high percentage of architecture, but rather construction worker doing just their jobs, and it's kind of working, and elements which you would describe as sins working there. Or for example, when we take Berlin as a city, they are like historic Berlin. It was boring. Like they just reproduced the same element all over again. There was no idea. It was lazy. It was auto-centric. It was unsustainable. So I don't meant it as a critic on your lecture, because I normally argue the same, but I just wanted to ask, like, in the round, what actually makes good architecture? Because like this very building was burned to the ground because people hated it, and now we're cheering it so up because I would argue maybe we as people and give it meaning, and we should focus more on social ideas and social coherence. So even ugly places and ugly buildings can make beautiful architecture if we stop being such an ugly society, I guess. Thanks.
Sure. I think it's a valid point. I mean, right, every building, I think there's an argument for the architecture of bureaucracy, like, right, there's an everyday architecture. Everything isn't going to be designed to be beautiful, but I do think, and with like the highest possible standards. On the other hand, there are challenges that we're. I think we need to ask for buildings that are going to be sustainable, buildings that are going to facilitate us having a future and not being underwater or 3,000 degrees every day, that are going to help build our communities. So I'm leery of, I do it because I'm a critic, but I try and avoid like the questions of style. I try and be agnostic about style. And when I'm thinking about a building, the question is like, what is it doing? How is it working for the people who have to deal with it on an everyday basis? And I think, that's a way of thinking about architecture that's not like, is it good design or bad design? Is that maybe that's a response to your question? I don't know. We can talk over drinks.
Hi, thank you for the lecture and very interesting observations. Kind of actually a related question. You talked about you don't like to talk about taste or style, but I guess one can say a critic is a tastemaker. I'm wondering, like, did you ever contemplate the fact that, or why this kind of architecture is seen as ugly or boring or bad versus other more, what we think, more interesting ones, and why this is kind of intrinsically, or maybe not intrinsically, why this is bad building versus a more designy good building?
I just don't think it's that hard to discern. Honestly, you drive around, Dallas or any other city, and you see these cheap buildings. They're badly made. They're a disaster for pedestrians. They are cheap. They're unsustainable. We're gonna have to rebuild them in 20 years, which is just a catastrophe of materials, of environmentally, et cetera. So at Yale, in here, it's easy to say what is quality and what is not quality, but when you get out into the world, I think it's a lot easier to determine.
Well, I guess I'm more thinking we should question where our taste came from, not necessarily just I know it when I see it.
Oh, for sure. I think that's critical. Always. I think part of criticism is always, the critic is always criticizing him or her or themselves, right? It's like, what are your preconceived notions? What are you taking for granted? I think, I mentioned this in the talk, is like, looking at the things that we all take for granted is like one of the principal jobs of the critic. And, our own assumptions is part of that.